Hello everyone and welcome to the National Army Museum for this week's Friday Insight. Here at the museum we tell the story of the British Army and the people who served in it from the Civil Wars to the present day through our galleries, collections, programmes and research. There are many ways you can support the museum. You can buy a book in our shop, visit the cafe, donate or become a member so you can get exclusive discounts and your very own events programme. I'm delighted today to welcome Dr. Kevin Weddle. Kevin is a distinguished fellow at the US Army War College, the former professor of military theory and strategy, and the Elihu Root Chair of Military Studies. He's a retired Army colonel and a veteran of Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm and Operation Enduring Freedom. This is his second book, The Compleat Victory, which has won the Gilder Lehrman Prize for Military History, the Francis Tavern Museum Book Award, and the Society of the Cincinnati Prize. Today, he'll be talking about the subject of the book, The Compleat Victory, the Battle of Saratoga, a complete turning point in the American War of Independence. He will also be signing copies of his book at the end. Just a quick tech note. If there are any technical difficulties, please be gentle with us. For people online, if your stream freezes, just refresh it, it usually works. There's also going to be a member of staff in the chat the entire time for you to ask any technical questions. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Kevin Weddle.
Thanks, Amy. Well, thanks, Amy, for that wonderful introduction. And it's a real honor and a privilege for me to be here at the National Army Museum. I've done research for books here. The National Army Museum staff has been absolutely wonderful in helping me get permission to use images in their collection. So this is a really important place, and I feel very close to it. So, and thank you all for coming out. This is a great turnout. So 83 years ago this June, Winston Churchill was in Washington, D.C. meeting with Franklin Roosevelt in one of their many strategy conferences during the Second World War. And while at the meeting, he heard the stunning news that German Field Marshal Rommel had just seized the critical port of Tobruk from the British. FDR noticed that the Prime Minister was in some distress, so he said, Winston, what's the problem? And Churchill turned to him and he said, Mr. President, I am the most miserable Englishman in America since John Burgoyne. So today, we're going to talk about why that other Englishman was so unhappy. So the Saratoga campaign was one of the most pivotal military campaigns, certainly in American history, and you can certainly argue in world history. The campaign included 10 battles and engagements. It lasted almost 5 months. It was complex, it was fluid, it played out over hundreds and hundreds of square miles of mostly wilderness terrain in upstate New York. The personalities involved were about as interesting as any you'll ever come across. But more important than that, the Saratoga campaign changed the very character of the American War of Independence. So my book on Saratoga, what I tried to do with the book on Saratoga is cover the entire campaign and all of its political, military, strategic implications, and what I try to do is dissect all the decision making, the strategy formulation, and all the key players' leadership on both sides. So in the short time we have today, obviously we're going to be flying along at wave top level. I'll try to hit the high points of the campaign, and then hopefully we can fill in some of the gaps during the Q&A. So. In late August 1777, Britain's King George III received momentous news. And these great tidings so thrilled the monarch of Great Britain that he burst into his wife's chambers, waving this message in the air and saying, I have beat them. I have beat the Americans. Now, what he had just learned is that Lieutenant General John Burgoyne and his army had captured the strategically vital post of Fort Ticonderoga that set astride the great Lake Champlain, Hudson River Valley invasion route from Canada, to and from Canada. So this victory was achieved with almost no casualties. So the king was absolutely thrilled, and he was certain that the military strategy that they had put into place the preceding spring was going to finally end the American Revolution, and that it was going exactly according to plan. But less than 2 months after the king's impromptu celebration, Burgoyne and his army met with an unprecedented disaster, and the British were faced with a very, very different war. So what I want to do to start with is just to provide a little bit of context. Now, I'm not going to talk about how the war began. I'm not going to talk about any of that stuff, but I do want to put it in military context and go over very, very briefly the military campaigns that took place, or the military events that took place before the Saratoga campaign. Of course, April 1775, the shot heard around the world, Lexington and Concord. We're coming up, of course, on the 250th anniversary of that. The Americans will seize Fort Ticonderoga from a British garrison without firing a shot in May of 75. The bloody Battle of Bunker Hill takes place outside Boston. During that time, after this battle takes place, this really horrific battle, the British knew that probably this revolution was a real thing and they weren't going to be able to put it down very quickly. The Americans try to seize Quebec in December of 75. They failed miserably. We really coveted Canada back then. And we will try. Oh, and we do now, too, don't we? Yeah. And so we try to take Canada several times. We try to do it again in the War of 1812, but failed miserably. So I suspect we're going to fail miserably this time, too. The British try to take Charleston in February 76. They do not succeed. They will succeed sooner or later, though, later on in the war. The British now will evacuate Boston. Now, you'll notice from my PowerPoint, it's one of the, if you're ever assigned to the Pentagon, it's one of the few things you actually learn how to do is do PowerPoint. So the British will evacuate Boston, and for several months, there's actually no British soldiers in the colonies, in the American colonies. But they will come back with a vengeance. General Howe, the new commander-in-chief, will come back from Nova Scotia. He'll land on Staten Island, and then there'll be several important campaigns on Long Island and then on Manhattan, too, where the American Army under General George Washington is basically chased out of New York City, and they will be basically pursued across New Jersey, with the army basically falling apart. So the American army is falling apart, and it looks like the war will end very, very quickly. The British try to come down from Canada into northern New York, but they're stopped, mainly because of the weather, but also there's a naval battle on Lake Champlain called the Battle of Valcour Island that slows them down a bit. And finally, Washington is going to stop the bleeding, stop the hemorrhaging of his army by two brilliant operations that are mostly, they're really not big battles, they're mostly raids. You can call them raids instead of big campaigns. But the Battle of Trenton in late December 76, and then the battle followed up very quickly with the victory at the Battle of Princeton in January of 77. So the strategic situation as we go into early 1777 is the British now occupy that great port city of New York City, the second largest city in America. Philadelphia is the first. And Washington's army barely escapes destruction. So there is a chance for the Americans to rebuild after that. So the British now they're looking as they go into 1777, hey, we had a chance to end this war earlier in 1775 or 1776. Let's finish it now in 1777. So they're going to come up with a new strategy. Now, these are the main architects of the British strategy. And one of the most fascinating, I think, confusing things about the Saratoga campaign and the American Revolution in general is the strategic part. And particularly for the Saratoga campaign is how that strategy was developed. Well more than half of my book talks about the British side of this campaign. So these are the four major players. Of course, you've got the king. You already met him on my first slide, going clockwise here. General Sir William Howe, who is the British commander-in-chief with his headquarters in New York City. Just below the king there is Lieutenant General John Burgoyne, who was the second in command in Canada, but now he's back in London. Early 1777, he's back in London. And then off to the left there, you have Lord George Germain. George Germain is the Secretary of State for the Colonies. Also, his title is also sometimes called the Secretary of State for America. He is basically the king's minister in charge of running the war in North America. So these are the key players. Now, strategy. What am I talking about when I say strategy? Strategy is probably one of the most misused words in the English language. You hear it all the time. You hear it in TV commercials for laundry soap. You see, I mean, it's just ridiculous. But one of the simplest definitions, the one I like to use, is strategy is the calculated application of ways and means to achieve a political objective. And we're talking about military strategy, so we're looking at the military element of power. So that sounds very, very simple, and it is simple, but it's very, very difficult to actually pull off. If it was easy, we'd be a lot better at it. And I would argue that America and the West has not been very good at military strategy since World War II, would be my argument. You may disagree with me, and I'd love to have a discussion with you during Q&A about that. But these are the guys. Okay, so Howe and Burgoyne in early 1777 will present competing plans on how they think the war should end. And again, there's General Howe on the left, General Burgoyne on the right. Just a second just to talk about this portrait. I just love this portrait. Isn't this great? This is kind of this is a Sir Joshua Reynolds portrait. And of course, if you had the money, you could get somebody like Sir Joshua Reynolds to paint your portrait. This is painted about 10 years before Saratoga, but it's the quintessential cavalryman, isn't it? The dashing cavalryman. I love that. And of course, that's what Burgoyne was. So first of all, we'll talk about Burgoyne's plan. So because Burgoyne is in London now, he's able to present this plan directly to Lord Germain and the King. So he's got a bit of an in there. And what he calls for this strategy is he calls for three converging columns. The main army, his main army, will come down from Canada, go down Lake Champlain, ultimately end up in Albany. And then a supporting force would come up the St. Lawrence River into Lake Ontario, and then across New York to the Mohawk River Valley, and then proceeding on to Albany as well. And then his plan finally called for General Howe's main army, sitting there in New York City, to come up the Hudson River, and all three of these columns would combine. And the idea was to split off the more rebellious New England colonies from what they thought were the less rebellious middle colonies and southern colonies. So that was the whole idea, and then New England would die on the vine. They could take control of the Hudson River Valley and then conduct unspecified operations into New England. So that was Howe's plan. As you can see, pretty complex, pretty imaginative. I would say this would be hard to pull off even today. But then when you think back in the late 18th century, over primarily wilderness terrain, time, distance, weather, this is going to be a tough thing to pull off. But the King and Germain absolutely loved this plan. They thought it was a fabulous plan. Now, General Howe, remember, he is the commander-in-chief, after all, sitting there in North America. He is the man on the ground. He has come up with a completely different plan. And he, by this time, in early 1777, he has come to the conclusion that George Washington and his army are the center of gravity of the American Revolution. You can't win this revolution, he thinks, without destroying Washington and his army. And actually, I think he was exactly right. So what he wants to do is he wants to use Philadelphia, the American capital, as bait, and then lure Washington into a decisive battle. That he knows if he can just come to grips with Washington, he can destroy him. So that's what Howe wants to do. He originally plans on going overland, but after Trenton and Princeton, he really doesn't have any stomach for that. So instead, he decides that he's going to load his troops on board transports, and with the Royal Navy under his brother, Admiral Lord Richard Howe, to guard them. They will come down up into the Chesapeake Bay and then land south of Philadelphia and then go overland to Philadelphia, which will force Washington to come to him. So that's his plan. Of the two, if you're looking at, are you able to achieve, or is your goal a really decisive objective? My argument would be that Howe's plan was made the most sense. But how do you reconcile those plans? If you have one of your big decision makers sitting there in New York City and the other three are sitting there in London, you've got a problem in the late 18th century, and that is time and distance. And it's at least 3,000 miles from London to New York, and a message can take up to 2 months to go one way. So imagine the difficulty of trying to coordinate strategy when you've got your commander-in-chief sitting there in New York, and you've got everybody else sitting there in London, and you're trying to coordinate strategy. You send a message to Howe, and you say, we're thinking of doing this, and Howe sends a message back, and it could be 3 months before you get an actual exchange of messages. So it's very, very challenging for the British to do that. And of course, I would argue that the way you really need to do that is give your commander-in-chief some guidance and let him kind of do his thing, but that's not what happens. So as you can imagine, there's going to be some misunderstandings and confusion. So what ends up happening, so there's that distance time thing. So what ends up happening is Lord George Germain, who's responsible for coordinating strategy, basically he approves Burgoyne's plan. He also approves Howe's plan. But he tells Howe, once you finish doing your thing around Philadelphia, then you go help Burgoyne. But Howe doesn't get that information until he's already at sea. And by that time, it's way too late for him to do much of anything. So basically what's happened is the orders have crossed, and they each are basically reading what they want to read, and they're kind of going with that. So there's very little real coordination happens. And so I think you can see what kind of problems are going to crop up. It's very confused, a lot of misunderstandings, a lot of confusion. Burgoyne thinks Howe is going to come up the Hudson River. Of course, Howe is not. He's going to Philadelphia. He's been told you can go to Philadelphia. He is the commander-in-chief. So there's no controlling military strategy. Nobody is overall in charge. Which is a problem, of course. And instead of having one coherent military strategy for 1777, the British have two utterly uncoordinated military strategies. And I would argue that almost everything that happens during this campaign, during the Saratoga campaign, the seeds are sowed in early 1777 into the spring of 1777 because of these confusing orders going back and forth. In my book, I actually have a detailed appendix where I, choose what kind of life I have, I'm pretty boring. I actually sat down and traced every letter, every order going back and forth, when it was sent, when it was received. And you can just kind of follow the breadcrumbs and watch as the strategy basically falls apart as the weeks go on in 1777. Okay, so with that as background, let's talk about the campaign itself. So Burgoyne and his almost 10,000-man army will depart from Canada on the 14th of June, 1777, and they will arrive outside of Fort Ticonderoga on the 2nd of July. Brigadier General Barry St. Leger, who is in command of that supporting force that's supposed to go up the Mohawk River, he's got about 1,800 men. He leaves on the 23rd of June from Canada, and he arrives at the Mohawk River on the 2nd of August. Okay? And then, of course, General Howe will load his troops on ships on the 8th of July, but because of contrary winds, he's not actually able to sail for Philadelphia until the 23rd of July. So a lot of delays going on there. And in fact, because of the winds, and these are sailing vessels, of course, he doesn't land at the head of the Chesapeake Bay until the 25th of August. So there's almost a 2-month period where Howe is kind of out of the game because of his decision to go by sea. The main American army is sitting in Morristown, New Jersey, and that's commanded by George Washington. And the American Northern Army is commanded by Major General Philip Schuyler. His headquarters is in Albany. So this is the comparison of forces there. You've got the Americans commanded by Major General Philip Schuyler, and of course the British under Lieutenant General John Burgoyne. So the British, you can see he's got most of his force, the majority of his force are British regulars, but he's also got 4,000 Germans. Most of the time, when you hear about German troops under British command during the American Revolution, you hear of Hessians. These guys are not Hessians, or most of them are not Hessians. They're from Brunswick. But they are German allies. 650 Canadians. Here you see also Native Americans along as well. Philip Schuyler, and see the Americans over there, 5,500 Continentals. Those are equivalent to the regular army. It's still a pretty ragtag bunch. And then, of course, the militia, short-term folks who are just called out for emergencies. So Philip Schuyler, he's about 44 years old during this time. He's commander of the Northern Army. He also, that includes Fort Ticonderoga and the entire Northern Department up there. He's a native New Yorker. He's from the area. But he's also kind of this upper class patrician type. He comes across as really kind of haughty and arrogant. He's not particularly well liked by the American troops, his own troops, especially by militia, especially by New Englanders. They really don't like him. Burgoyne, he's about 55, so he's about 10 years older than that photo, or the painting, the Joshua Reynolds painting there. He's this career British cavalry officer. He's known to be very aggressive and flamboyant. That's, of course, what you want for a cavalryman. Also known to be pretty pompous and arrogant, but he's very well liked by the troops, which is not all that usual in professional armies of the period. He served in America very early in the war, but he doesn't have much respect for Americans or American soldiers, and this is magnified after his very easy capture of Ticonderoga. He's a playwright. He becomes actually very famous as a playwright after the war. He's also an MP, and he's a favorite of George III. But despite serving almost his entire adult life in the British Army, this is his first real independent command. So he's been given a pretty tough one for the very first time around. Okay, so the Saratoga campaign, as I said, let's look at how it played out. So we'll start with Burgoyne's initial invasion. His first step was to take Ticonderoga, and as I said, he arrives outside of Ticonderoga on the 2nd of July. So Fort Ticonderoga, has any of you ever been to Fort Ticonderoga? Oh, great, handful, great, super. So this Fort Ticonderoga, this is a view of the fort from the high mountain next to it called Mount Defiance. Commanding the American troops, the American garrisons at Fort Ticonderoga is Major General Arthur Sinclair. He's a former British Army officer. There's several in the American Army. Another one I'll talk about in a few minutes. But Schuyler doesn't do a very good job of defending Ticonderoga. And when the British arrive, they notice that there's this tall, very tall hill that dominates Fort Ticonderoga. And Burgoyne's second in command, Major General Phillips, who's also an artilleryman, saw that and he goes, you know, if we put an artillery battery up there, we're basically going to make that fort untenable. And so he decides to do that. And there's this great story of one of his officers looked at, and that's the hill that we're talking about here, and that's the summit, obviously. And one of his officers said, "Sir, a goat can't climb that hill." And he said, "Only a goat can climb that hill." And Philip said, "Where a goat can go, a man can go, or where a man can go, he can drag a gun." And they did. In a matter of several hours, they were able to drag an entire battery up on top of that hill and start lobbing shells right down into Ticonderoga. And basically, when that happened, when the Americans failed to secure Mount Defiance overlooking Fort Ticonderoga, it was all over when the British were able to put a battery up there. And so Sinclair orders an evacuation of the fort on the 5th of July, and they're all gone. So the British are able to basically walk into the fort unopposed on the 6th of July. I'm pretty critical of Sinclair's leadership in the book. So in a matter of days, basically Burgoyne had taken possession of the great fortress of Ticonderoga, and it's almost impossible to overstate the negative impact on the Americans caused by the loss of Fort Ticonderoga. Washington, Congress, the nearby state governments, they were all appalled that Sinclair and Schuyler had allowed this to happen, because they had been led to believe that Fort Ticonderoga was basically impregnable. This easy victory also fed Burgoyne's overconfidence and hubris, since he had initially believed that taking Fort Ticonderoga would be the toughest part of the entire campaign. And then in the meantime, Schuyler, the American commander up there, starts to panic. So he loses Ticonderoga, and Burgoyne is basically loose. And so he starts worrying, and he starts sending this series of panicky messages to Washington and to Congress. Okay, so we've talked about Burgoyne's easy capture of Fort Ticonderoga. Let's look at that supporting column that comes down the Mohawk River, or that's their job, to come down the Mohawk River. All right, so I'll give you a different view here, a close-up view. So Sinclair departs Canada on the 23rd of July, and as he approaches the Mohawk River, he encounters Fort Stanwix, and that's the picture there in the inset. It's been rebuilt now by the National Park Service, so again, another great place to visit. It was thought by British intelligence to be totally in ruins, but actually had been repaired, and it was now manned by an American garrison. So St. Leger basically had to defeat that fort before he could proceed on down the river. So on the 2nd of August, 1777, he begins a siege. So the Americans are outnumbered about 3-1. So these are worse odds than the Americans faced at Ticonderoga. The American garrison at Stanwix was under the inspired leadership of Colonel Peter Gansevoort, a 26-year-old colonel from the local area, and he does just a brilliant job commanding that fort. And the contrast between his leadership and Sinclair's leadership at Ticonderoga really could not be more stark. So once this siege begins, there at Stanwix, an American relief force, mainly militia, marches overland to the relief of the fort. And as they approach the fort, they are attacked, basically ambushed, by a detachment that St. Leger had sent out to meet them. And the fighting there at the Battle of Oriskany was probably the bloodiest of the American Revolution. There was probably more casualties by percentage on both sides at the Battle of Oriskany, because it was basically a battle of brother against brother. These were people who all lived in the Mohawk River Valley, the American militia, and the detachment that Burgoyne had sent out, that St. Leger had sent out, was primarily Native Americans and all who had lived in the valley, so mainly Iroquois, Indians, and also American loyalists that were supporting the British cause that also lived in the Mohawk River Valley. So it was very, very vicious. So they're not able to break through to relieve the siege, but Benedict Arnold, the American commander, Major General Benedict Arnold, will take a detachment from the main army, and he will march overland. And because St. Leger loses so many troops at the Battle of Oriskany, his Indians desert on him after that battle. He decides he's not going to be able to make it, so he pulls back to Canada. Arnold checks out the fort, makes sure everything's okay, and then he basically goes back and returns to the garrison. So Gansevoort and the Stanwix garrison held out for 22 days. So it was quite a extended siege, and it was one of the most positive things that happened for the Americans in many, many months. So it was really a needed victory. So let's now continue. So now St. Leger's column is out because of what happens at Fort Stanwix, the failed siege. And since Howe is on his way to Philadelphia, Burgoyne is on his own. So let's zero in now on that little box there. Okay. So, but before I do that, just a brief mention of George Washington. You may be wondering, what's going on with Washington, what's going on with Howe at this time. So George Washington, of course, is the American commander-in-chief. Howe is the British commander-in-chief. And I thought it was very interesting as I looked at these two men during the course of this campaign, and I found that despite the fact that Howe, I think, again, had the right idea, go after Philadelphia, draw out Washington, destroy him in a battle, Washington really acted as a true commander-in-chief. I mean, he not only was worried about what was going on around Philadelphia, he was worried about obviously countering Howe's operations around Philadelphia, but he also had his eyes on what was happening 300 miles to the north, up with what's going on with Burgoyne and Schuyler. So he basically acts as a true commander-in-chief and encompasses the entire war. So he understands that what goes on in the north is going to affect the overall mission of independence for the Americans. Howe does not do that. I mean, he is laser focused on Philadelphia because. And when you see Burgoyne moving down into New York, he basically comes under Howe, but Howe basically ignores him. So I thought it was very interesting the contrast between these two commanders-in-chief. Washington is really acting as a commander-in-chief, and Howe really isn't. He's acting more as an army commander instead of a commander-in-chief. One of the most important things Washington does is he sends really experienced leaders up to help out Schuyler. He sends people like Major General Benedict Arnold, arguably the most competent and aggressive combat commander the Americans have. He sends Major General Benjamin Lincoln up there, who's really good with militia. He sends other forces, and he also sends Colonel Daniel Morgan and his riflemen, an elite bunch from Virginia and Pennsylvania, who are well trained on the use of the rifle. Of course, most of these soldiers have smoothbore weapons. These Americans had riflemen. Now, the British have riflemen, the Germans have riflemen, but these guys are really well trained. So think, if there's equivalent, think of Colonel Daniel Morgan and the SAS. You know, a small elite group that everybody wants, but there's only a few of them to go around. So Washington has the wherewithal to send Morgan and his riflemen up to join Schuyler instead of keeping them with him, which of course would have been the selfish thing. All right, so just a quick aside on that. So let's go over this, and you can see Lake Champlain coming down, the blue up there in the area, where the red unit is up there. That's Burgoyne seizing Ticonderoga, and the Americans are down near Fort Edward. And then the Hudson River Valley flows south of that blue unit marker there. So here's the two major commanders, and here is my calendar chart here, so you can kind of follow along on the dates. So again, Burgoyne seizes Ticonderoga on the 6th of July. The Americans will retreat out to the west. Burgoyne will send a pursuing force after them. They will catch them at a place called Hubbardton, this teeny tiny little hamlet of Hubbardton, which is bigger then than it is now. And it's the only battle of the American Revolution fought in Vermont. So the Americans will lose that battle, but they will stop the British pursuit. So it's a very important battle for the Americans, even though they lose it. Burgoyne will continue on. He will scatter other Americans retreating from Fort Ticonderoga at a place called Skenesboro, which is at the southern tip of Lake Champlain. So Burgoyne is winning battle after battle. Even though these are fairly small, he's winning them. He basically takes the entire army to Skenesboro, and he concentrates them there before they move south. He stays there for about 2 weeks before he starts moving south. And then ultimately he will move south to Fort Edward. The Americans will continue to retreat in the face of Burgoyne's advance. Now, even though the Americans are retreating, Schuyler does a pretty good job with his local knowledge of the area. He's from that area. And he uses his troops pretty well. He obstructs these routes. And these aren't nice, well cared for roads. These are basically little tracks through the forest. So he has his troops working to obstruct those roads, which really slow down Burgoyne's advance. So again, he's 2 weeks at Skenesboro, he's 2 weeks at Fort Edwards, mainly because of this very, very slow advance that the Americans have done. But still, although Schuyler does a pretty good job with all this, kind of retrieving the garrison that escaped outside of Ticonderoga, kind of rebuilding the army a little bit after the disaster at Ticonderoga, you can't tell from all of his messages going back to Washington. They show a man who is out of his depth, who is panicking, who is begging for support because the sky is falling and we're going to lose the revolution, we're going to lose the battle. And so ultimately, the Americans just get sick of his whining, and they will relieve him of his command. Now, again, 2 more weeks at Fort Edwards. Burgoyne will move south to a place called Fort Miller. These are all abandoned, deteriorating forts from the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War. So he arrives at Fort Miller, and by the time Burgoyne arrives at Fort Miller, he starts running into logistical problems. Dire logistical problems, because he had left Canada without enough logistical support. Not only supplies, but also transport. And maybe we can talk about that during the Q&A, why he did that. He did that knowingly. He knew he had deficiencies in those areas, yet he continued on. And there's a reason for that, and maybe, again, we can talk about that in Q&A. But at any rate, he's in such dire straits that he stays at Fort Miller for 3 whole weeks trying to gather more supplies before he continues on. And again, just a quick review. 2 weeks at Skenesboro, 2 weeks at Fort Edward, and 3 weeks at Fort Miller. So he's moving very, very, very slowly, and he gives the Americans time. And that's one of the things that Schuyler does succeed at. He buys time for the Americans by slowing Burgoyne down as he's moving south. So basically, Americans are trading space for time. So finally, Congress is sick of what's going on with Schuyler. They replace him with this guy. This is Major General Horatio Gates. Horatio Gates is about 50, so he's about 5 years younger than Burgoyne at this point. He's a former British Army officer. He serves in America during the French and Indian War. That's where he meets Washington. He likes America, so not long after the war, he resigns his commission. He sells his commission and returns to America with his family and sets up roots there. And so he basically becomes Americanized. So when the war begins, he offers his services to the American Army. Washington gladly accepts him as this old professional, brings him in and makes him basically adjutant general of the American Army. But he has great ambition. He believes he's better than Washington. He believes he should have an independent command. Now, he's a good manager. He understands logistics very well. He believes in defensive warfare. And he likes Americans, and he likes to use American militia. He understands how to use them best. Very unusual for most American senior leaders during that time. But he's pretty good at all that. But he's also kind of arrogant and pompous. But then again, a lot of these guys are. They're all type A's. So again, by mid-August, Burgoyne's logistical situation now is extremely dire. And so he sends this large detachment of German troops, about 1,000 men, with some British with him, about 1,000 men to go to a little town called Bennington, Vermont, because he had heard through intelligence, through interviewing loyalists in the area, that there was a large amount of cattle and oxen and carts, just exactly the stuff he's short of. So he sends this detachment down there. Unfortunately for Burgoyne, they are intercepted by an American force of mostly militia, and they basically destroy this entire detachment. So when I say destroy, mostly captured, but killed, wounded, and captured. So basically, Burgoyne has lost 1,000 men in a day on the 16th of August, 1777. So now Burgoyne is in deep, deep trouble, and he's got a decision to make. Do I continue on to Albany, which is my mission, or do I concentrate on maybe save the army, move back to Ticonderoga, kind of regroup? He decides to push forward. In the meantime, Gates has taken command. He's going to move the army north. Very slowly and tentatively, and he'll ultimately find good defensible terrain at a place called Bemis Heights on the left bank, the west bank of the Hudson River. And there, the defensive-minded Gates will dig in. So in the meantime, Burgoyne decides he is going to continue on to Albany. So he crosses the Hudson River to the west side. He continues down south, and then he arrives near the American camp at Bemis Heights. And there they will fight the first battle of Saratoga, called the Battle of Freeman's Farm. Now, this battle is one of the most vicious battles during the course of the war. The British will lose 3 times the amount of casualties that the Americans have, but they are able to achieve a nominal victory. They're able to hold on to the battlefield, and so Burgoyne is able to paint that as a great victory. But now, again, he's got another decision. What do I do? The Americans are blocking my route to Albany. Do I continue on or try to continue on, or do I fall back? And while he's trying to ponder that decision, he'll dig in, and General Sir Henry Clinton will throw him a lifeline. Henry Clinton is Howe's second in command. He's been left in New York City with the vague instructions of, hey, if Burgoyne ever needs help, you may see what you can do for him. So he's sitting down there in New York City. Let's switch to him. So that wonderful picture of Sir Henry Clinton, courtesy of the National Army Museum. So he's sitting down here in New York City, and all the messages he had received from Burgoyne up to this point said everything's going swimmingly, everything's going great, and then all of a sudden he gets word that I'm in deep trouble, and you've got to come and help me. So Clinton does his best. He scrapes up as many troops as he possibly can. He scrapes up about 3,000 guys. He loads them on transports. He has 3 Royal Navy ships to help out, and he sails north up the Hudson River to see what he can do to help out Burgoyne. So they will finally get ready to go in early October. He moves up. There are 2 major American forts just south of West Point, New York. West Point is not a fortification by this time. That comes later. But at this point, there are 2 American fortifications guarding the entrance to the Hudson Highlands. Fort Montgomery and Fort Clinton. No relation to this Clinton. So General Clinton quickly makes short work of those 2 fortresses, and he continues on up the river. They will get to Kingston, New York. He'll burn down the town. At the time, it was the capital of New York. He burns the town down, and he continues north with the idea, again, to provide some help to Burgoyne. But as they move farther and farther north, none of the local pilots want to guide those ships up the Hudson River. And they also find that the area is teeming with American militia and Continental troops. And so finally, they're forced to pull back. And when they do, they're no closer than 70 miles away from Burgoyne. And unfortunately, Burgoyne never receives information from Clinton that he was stopped and forced to fall back. So Burgoyne thinks Clinton is coming to his rescue. All right, so this is a picture I took a few years back. It's also in the book of Bemis Heights. So you can see this high ground dominates the Hudson River and the road to Albany. So that high-speed road today is the same track, the route to Albany back then. So it dominates basically the only way that Burgoyne can get to Albany. Now, while Clinton's futile rescue attempt was playing out, there was also a lot of drama on the American side. Gates and his second-in-command, Benedict Arnold, who had commanded the left wing during the Battle of Freeman's Farm, had a bitter quarrel over who was to take credit for that battle and over what to do next. So the aggressive Arnold is saying, we need to come out of our fortifications and go get these guys because we've got them on the ropes. Gates is saying, nope, the most important thing is to keep this defensive position so Burgoyne can't get past us and move on to Albany. And so for 2 weeks, these 2 American generals are exchanging letters, notes back and forth, even though their headquarters tents are half a mile apart. And all that correspondence is available, and it's hilarious reading this stuff. It's just so juvenile. These two senior officers going back and forth. You insulted me, and it's just absolutely ridiculous. So at this point, more and more militia are flowing into the American Army. So during the Battle of Freeman's Farm, the 2 forces were almost exactly equal. By the time we move into early October, the Americans now have almost 11,000 troops. 11,000 versus about 6,000 that Burgoyne has now. So Burgoyne is heavily outnumbered. Now, obviously, you all know, you're all interested in military history, you wouldn't be here. You know that the battle doesn't always go to the strongest. So Burgoyne still has a chance, but I think he really made a major error by not taking advantage of his nominal victory at Freeman's Farm and falling back or doing something aggressive, but he doesn't do that. So he's rapidly running out of supplies. He has to reduce rations 3 times for his starving men and his starving animals. And so he finally decides, with no word from Clinton, that he decides to personally lead a 1,700-man reconnaissance force out of their fortifications, out of the British fortifications, and first and foremost, look for food. That's the most important thing. And secondly, see if there was any way they can find a route that would allow them to squeeze by the Americans. At any rate, no matter what, it was a very desperate attempt. All right, so let's look at that second Battle of Saratoga there, and we're getting toward the end. So on mid-morning, on the 7th of October, Burgoyne will personally lead this kind of ad hoc 1,700-man reconnaissance force out of the fortifications. Here you can see him doing that. After a short march, they run across a field of unharvested wheat. So we're talking about October, so harvest time. So they're thrilled to find this unharvested field of wheat. So Burgoyne immediately has his guys starting to, gather up the food. But the Americans spot it almost instantly. They spot this movement out of his fortifications very quickly, and Gates sends out Morgan's riflemen. And Morgan's riflemen will start the Second Battle of Saratoga, or the Battle of Bemis Heights. His riflemen immediately start causing heavy casualties, especially amongst the officers. They're trained to pick off officers and NCOs, of course, going after leaders. He sends another brigade out, and very, very quickly, Burgoyne's force starts to fall apart, starts to lose cohesion, and Burgoyne he tries to conduct an orderly retreat, but his aide that he sends out to get the word out to everybody to start falling back is shot and mortally wounded. In fact, his gorget is actually in the National Army Museum's collection, that officer who was killed. So Burgoyne sends him out, he's killed, so nobody gets the word. So things are basically falling apart very, very quickly. Burgoyne's best general officer, arguably, Brigadier General Simon Fraser, is mortally wounded during all this chaos. And he, let me go ahead. He dies the next day in agony. This is also in the National Army Museum collection. This is the funeral of Simon Fraser. This happens the next day while American artillery rounds are flying overhead. So we'll go back to this. So, as I already briefly mentioned, Gates and Arnold had this very bitter and juvenile dispute that lasted sometime immediately after that first battle on the 17th of September until sometime around the 3rd of October. So that's Benedict Arnold there on the left. That is, of course, Horatio Gates, and they had this conflict. And that's one of the most unusual monuments that you'll run across in America at the Saratoga battlefield. It's called the Arnold Boot Monument. And I'll explain a little bit more about it in a few minutes, but there's actually no writing on it. So you don't know it's for Arnold unless you talk to the Park Service or you've done a little research. So now we'll come to one of the most famous of the many myths attached to the Saratoga campaign. There's many, many myths according to about the Saratoga campaign. I've tried to put as many to bed as I can in the course of my book, but this is probably the most famous. And that is because of this quarrel that they have, that this very aggressive kind of hothead Arnold had demanded that he be relieved of his command and allowed to go to Philadelphia. Instead, Gates puts him under arrest, confines him to his tent. This is all part of the myth. And that when the Second Battle of Saratoga kicks off, Arnold, hearing the shots, leaves his tent without orders, jumps on his horse, rides out, takes control of the battle, and wins the day. So that's the myth. And while that is happening, Gates is cowering like a coward in his tent. So that's the myth. And of course, it's a great story, isn't it? It's a super story. It's the story that's been passed down since about 1820, and every historian writing about Saratoga has repeated that story. Unfortunately, it's not true. Again, it's a great story, but it's not true. The real story is actually not bad, and it puts both of those general officers in a lot better light than that story does. But it's a story that I think has had staying power because it's very dramatic. It's a great contrast to Benedict Arnold's later treason, and of course it makes a veritable villain out of Horatio Gates, which makes a lot of sense because after this happens, he does a lot of bad things, Gates. So he's not a particularly likable guy. So, again, too bad it's not true. But when you combine old evidence with new evidence, it's clear that something else happened altogether. And these two men had basically reconciled before the start of the second battle. So let me go back to the second battle. At one point, as Arnold is out there commanding the left wing, had never been relieved of his command. He's commanding the left wing. He's controlling the forces that are engaged with Burgoyne's reconnaissance force. and he notes, he sees a point of weakness. And he rides back to see Gates, who is in the fortifications down there, and he says, "It's late in the day, but let me have some men, and we will have some fun with them before sunset." And this is a quote from this new source that we found recently. So he sends a brigade out. Arnold personally leads this brigade. They finish up causing this reconnaissance force to collapse. They fall back into their fortifications. Most of the British forces will fall back into the light infantry redoubt that you see there in red, but a smaller number will fall back into the German camp called Bremen's Fortified Camp. So first, Arnold will try to attack the light infantry redoubt. He gets nowhere. The British do a good job defending that. And then he notices that there's a gap between the light infantry redoubt and Bremen's fortified camp that he can exploit. And he personally leads another force directly into Bremen's fortified camp. He breaks through and he kills the German commander. American forces kill the German commander. Arnold himself is seriously wounded in the leg, hence the boot monument. But the Americans will seize that far right of the British forces, and Burgoyne is now forced to fall back. Really, there's nothing he can do with the Americans firmly entrenched on his right. So the British will fall back, and you can see that. And that's the painting that's basically the cover of my book, and that's supposed to depict Arnold leading his men into the Bremen's fortified camp. You can see the sun is setting in the background, so that's what that's supposed to portray. And minutes after this painting portrays is when Arnold is seriously wounded. So. Now, really, Burgoyne has no choice. He has to fall back. So he does. So in a driving cold rain, they start trudging north, but they grind to a halt after 8 miles at a place called Saratoga, with the Americans chasing right behind them. By this time, the Americans have 17,000 soldiers in their army, mainly militia. And in the space of just a couple days, Burgoyne is completely surrounded, and it's really all over. So after several days of tense negotiations, terms were agreed to on the 16th of October. Burgoyne had left Canada with 10,000 men, and only 15 weeks after seizing the great fortress of Ticonderoga, he ends up surrendering almost 6,000 soldiers. And on the 17th of October, he ended up surrendering as the American band played Yankee Doodle. He surrenders his army to Gates, as depicted in this famous John Trumbull painting that hangs in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda in Washington, D.C. So what were the strategic implications? Well, there's a lot of short and long-term ones. Obviously, American morale soars. British morale plummets. The news arrives in London on the 2nd of December, and it's really a shock to the system. There's opposition in Parliament. There's a small but vocal opposition to the war, and there's even a smaller but vocal pro-American segment in Parliament. They get larger. More people come to their side. Now the British have to worry about potential overseas interventions. So there's all sorts of things. The British at this point will also decide that they're going to send a peace emissaries over to America, and they'll end up offering America basically everything they want except independence. So basically, they were offering them what we would consider Commonwealth status today. But the Americans after Saratoga will say, no, sorry. But the most important were the long-term implications. And that was the head of the American diplomatic delegation in France will reopen negotiations with Louis XVI and his ministers. And just a few weeks after the great victory at Saratoga, which proved that the Americans have staying power, the French will agree to come in on our side. They had already been on our side covertly, but now they come in overtly, and they sign on the 6th of February, 1778, they'll sign a treaty with America. Now we started with now Saratoga has led to what the British will fear most, and that is a much wider war. Instead of just with the Americans, now they have now they are going to war with another, one of their continental traditional enemies, and then Spain will also join the war on the American side in 1779. So we started with Winston Churchill. Let's end with him. He once said that the only thing worse than fighting with an ally is fighting without one. So Americans very quickly learned the truth of that. The French are difficult allies, but still they start with some welcome naval support. And finally, in 1780, the French will land an army in America, and they'll ultimately combine with Washington's, ending in the final and decisive American victory at Yorktown in October of 1781. So quite simply, America could not have had a Yorktown without a Saratoga. The great victory of Saratoga changed the entire character of the American Revolution. And although Saratoga was not sufficient to guarantee American independence, it was necessary. And it was, as one American general wrote after Burgoyne's surrender, it was the complete victory. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions.